The night his own son told him to sleep in the garage, Leonard Webb didn't argue. He just picked up his old army blanket, the olive drab one he'd carried home from Kandahar 14 years ago, folded it under his arm, and walked out through the side door without a word. The garage smelled like motor oil and rust and the particular cold that settles into concrete floors in October. He pulled a lawn chair up near the water heater, sat down, and listened to the house through the wall. He could hear his daughter-in-law laughing at something on television. His son's voice low and satisfied. The clink of glasses. Leonard had lived in that house for 6 weeks. He had been in that house. His house, the one he'd bought in 1987, the one where he'd raised 2 kids on a soldier's pay, for 6 weeks as a guest, and now he was in the garage. He did not sleep much that night, but the dog did, pressed flat against his feet, her warm weight the only thing that felt real. Her name was Scout. She was 4 years old, a German shepherd with one ear that didn't quite stand all the way up, and she had been with Leonard since he left the Veterans Rehabilitation Center in Chilliwack 2 years prior. They'd given her to him as a service animal for the anxiety. But she had become something else entirely. She was, without exaggeration, the one creature in his life that had never once looked at him like he was a problem to be solved. The trouble had started, or maybe more accurately, the trouble had finally surfaced 3 months earlier, when Leonard's older brother Russell died and left him the property. Russell had been the quiet one in the family, never married, worked 40 years as a surveyor for the provincial government in British Columbia, retired to a piece of land he'd bought in the early 90s, up near the Similkameen River, east of Princeton. Nobody had visited him much. Leonard had a handful of times, driving the 6 hours from Surrey with a case of beer and a few days to spare. The land was beautiful in a rough, unhurried way. 60 acres of ponderosa pine and bunch grass dropping down to a creek that ran cold even in August. There was a farmhouse on it, old enough that the front porch leaned slightly to the left, and a big cedar barn behind it that Russell had never really used. When the lawyer called to say Russell had left it all to Leonard, there was a silence on the other end of the line. When Leonard told his son, Kyle, that silence stretched out about 3 seconds too long. "That's the property up near Princeton," Kyle said finally. "The one that's basically falling apart." "It's in decent shape," Leonard said. "Russell kept it up, Dad." Kyle had a way of saying that single syllable that somehow managed to contain an entire argument. "That property has no road access in winter. The house needs a new roof. You can't live there. I wasn't planning to live there right away." "Then what are you planning to do with it?" Leonard hadn't known yet. He was still in the early stage of just being surprised that Russell had thought of him at all. What happened over the following weeks happened gradually and then all at once. The way most things do when money is involved. Kyle and his wife, Nadine, started talking about the land, as though it were already a problem they were managing on Leonard's behalf. They mentioned a developer in the Okanagan who was buying rural parcels. They talked about access roads and assessed value, and the cost of maintaining property taxes on land you weren't using. They were reasonable conversations, presented reasonably. And Leonard had been tired, and still not quite right from the medications they'd adjusted at his last appointment. And he had listened without pushing back. Then Kyle suggested that maybe it would be easier if Leonard signed a power of attorney for property matters, just to simplify things. That was when Leonard started paying closer attention. He didn't sign anything. He said he needed time to think, which was true. What he didn't say was that something in the way Kyle had said the words, casually, at dinner, like it was already decided, had made the old familiar thing rise up in his chest. The thing he recognized from 31 years in the military. The thing that told him the briefing he was being given was not the whole picture. The garage happened 2 nights after that conversation. It started with Nadine saying she needed Leonard's room for her sister, who was visiting from Calgary. And could Leonard maybe stay in the garage, just for the week? They'd set up a cot. It wouldn't be long. Leonard looked at her. He looked at Kyle. Kyle looked at the floor. He didn't fight it. He'd learned a long time ago that the battles worth having were not the ones fought in living rooms over dinner. He took the army blanket. He took Scout. He went. He spent the next 4 days calling the lawyer in Princeton. The property, it turned out, was worth considerably more than Kyle's developer friend had suggested. There were water rights attached to it. Old rights, grandfathered, the kind that didn't get issued anymore, that made the land valuable to an entirely different category of buyer. There was also the matter of the barn, which Russell had apparently had assessed by someone, though the lawyer wasn't sure why. He mentioned it in a note he left with the will. The lawyer, a woman named Patricia Shore, told him on the third call. He said to make sure you went out there before you made any decisions. He said you'd understand when you got there. Leonard thought about that for a long time, sitting in the garage with Scout's head in his lap. He called a friend from his regiment, a man named Barry who had a truck and no particular schedule, and he asked if Barry would drive him up to the Similkameen. They left on a Tuesday morning before Kyle and Nadine were awake. The drive took them through the Fraser Canyon and out into the dry country east of Hope, the landscape changing from wet coastal forest to something older and more austere. Rocky bluffs above the highway, cottonwoods yellow along the creek bottoms, the sky big and pale blue, the way it only gets once you're past the mountains. Leonard watched it through the passenger window with Scout on the seat beside him. And for the first time in several months he felt something in his chest that wasn't dread. The property was exactly as he remembered it. The house sat back from the gravel road, behind a row of old poplars that had mostly lost their leaves. The porch did lean, but only slightly, and the door was stiff but unlocked. And when Leonard pushed it open, the smell that came out was the smell of his brother's life. Wood smoke and instant coffee, and the particular quiet of a man who had lived alone contentedly for decades. Scout went in first, which she always did, nose working, moving through the rooms with her shoulders low and her tail slow. Leonard followed her. The house had 4 rooms, a kitchen, a sitting room, a bedroom, and a small room Russell had used as an office, filled with survey maps and provincial topographic charts pinned to every wall. Leonard stood in the middle of the sitting room for a long time. There was a wood stove in the corner, cast iron, the kind that would heat the whole house if you kept it fed. A pair of Russell's boots beside the door, a photograph on the shelf above the stove. The two of them at their mother's house, summer of 1978, Leonard maybe 17 and Russell 22, both of them squinting into the sun. He hadn't seen that photograph in 30 years. Scout had moved to the far corner of the sitting room. She was doing something Leonard didn't recognize at first. Not sitting, not lying down, but pressing her nose into the junction between the floorboards and the baseboard, inhaling in long, focused pulls. Then she backed up and looked at him. "What is it, girl?" She went back to the corner and did it again. Leonard crouched down and looked. The floorboards in the corner were slightly different from the rest. Same wood, same age, but the grain ran in a slightly different direction. And when he pressed on one end, it gave. He got Barry's flashlight from the truck. He got a pry bar from the cedar barn, which turned out to contain, among other things, an entire wall of organized tools that Russell had maintained with the precision of a man who had spent his career measuring things to the millimeter. The boards came up cleanly. They'd been cut and relaid at some point, the edges smooth. Beneath them was a wooden hatch, maybe 3 feet by 2, with an iron ring set into it. Leonard stood up. He looked at Scout. She was sitting at the edge of the opening, perfectly still, watching him. He pulled the hatch open. The space below was not large, maybe 8 feet deep, concrete-lined, accessed by a wooden ladder that felt solid when he tested it. Barry shone the flashlight down while Leonard descended. At the bottom there were shelves along 2 walls, and on the shelves were things that took him a moment to understand. Documents first. A binder with plastic sleeves, each one holding a separate page. Water rights certificates, some going back to 1961. A surveyor's report commissioned 2 years ago. with values Leonard had to read twice. Mineral rights documentation. The land had been assessed for copper in the 70s, and the rights had never been sold. Title documents going back to the original preemptions in 1923, and behind the binders in a fireproof box that had a combination lock set to Leonard and Russell's shared childhood address, there were coins, military coins from their father's service, some silver and something else, a cloth bag, old canvas, heavy, gold maple leaves. Not many, maybe 40, but 40 was not nothing. Leonard sat down on the bottom rung of the ladder and held one of the coins and was quiet for a while. Russell had known. He had spent years understanding exactly what the property was worth, and he had protected it, and he had left it all. The documents, the rights, the box with the combination only family would know, for the one person he trusted to do something worthwhile with it. When Leonard climbed back up, Barry was standing by the window looking out at the barn. "You find something?" Barry asked. "Yes," Leonard said. "Good something or bad something?" Leonard looked at Scout, who had not moved from her post at the edge of the hatch. "Good," he said. He called Patricia Shore from the property that afternoon and told her he was not selling anything and that he needed a referral to an estate litigation lawyer in Vancouver. She gave him a name without hesitation, which told him she had perhaps been expecting the call. It was the next week that Kyle came to him, not to the garage. Leonard was no longer at the house in Surrey by then, staying instead at Barry's place in Abbotsford. But Kyle called, and his voice had a different quality than usual. Tighter, less certain. "Dad, I think we need to talk about the Princeton property." "I agree," Leonard said. "Nadine and I have been looking into it, and there are some assets attached to it that we weren't aware of." "I know." A pause. "We could work something out," Kyle said. "We're family." Leonard thought about the garage, about the army blanket, about 6 weeks of being managed, the way you managed a problem, the way his son had looked at the floor when Nadine said the word, "Coat." "I've retained a lawyer," Leonard said. "Any conversations about the estate should go through her." The silence that followed was long enough that Leonard heard Scout shift on the floor beside him. "Dad, I'll talk to you soon, Kyle." He hung up. What followed was not dramatic. It was paperwork, mostly. Long phone calls with the lawyer, whose name was Isabel Crane, and who turned out to be the kind of person who spoke very quietly and made very large problems feel manageable. There was a morning when Kyle and Nadine arrived at Barry's property, uninvited, and Leonard spoke to them through the screen door for 11 minutes, while Scout sat at his heel and watched them with an expression of complete, professional calm. There was a letter from a paralegal claiming Leonard lacked the capacity to manage his own affairs, a claim that was assessed by 2 independent physicians and dismissed within 3 weeks. Leonard had been through harder things. He had been through things that had made the walls of a room feel like they were made of water, and the sounds of ordinary life feel like they were coming from a great distance. He had spent time in that place, after Kandahar, after the second deployment, after the third. He knew what it felt like to be not right. And he also knew, with the clarity that had taken him years to build, that not right was not the same as not capable. He moved into the farmhouse in late November, 2 months after the first drive up with Barry. The roof needed work on one end, but Russell had left enough in a savings account, listed in the will, which Kyle's lawyer had somehow not yet gotten around to mentioning, to cover it. Leonard hired 2 men from Princeton, who knew the house and did the work in 3 days, shaking their heads at how solid the old beams were. He had the wood stove certified and lit it the night the roofers left. He made tea and sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the ponderosa pines and the last of the light going out of the sky above them. Scout was on the rug. She had, in the way of dogs, completely accepted this as home from the moment they arrived. She had her spot by the stove and her bowl in the kitchen corner, and her habit of standing at the back door in the evening to listen to whatever was moving in the pines. Leonard's daughter, Brenda, came up from Kelowna in December with her 2 kids and her husband. A quiet man named Cole who helped Leonard replace the porch boards and didn't ask many questions. Brenda had not been involved in any of the conversations about power of attorney. When Leonard told her what had happened, she sat at the kitchen table for a while without speaking. "I'm sorry I didn't know sooner," she said finally. "You have your life," Leonard said. "That's as it should be. Still." He poured her more tea. The kids were in the back room looking at Russell's topographic maps. Scout had positioned herself in the doorway between them and the adults, as she always did when children were present, watchful and still. The legal process concluded in February. Kyle and Nadine's claim of incapacity had been fully withdrawn. Isabel Crane had, with considerable efficiency, documented every asset attached to the property and filed the appropriate registrations on Leonard's behalf. The mineral rights alone, she told him, were something that several companies would have interest in, if Leonard ever chose to entertain offers, which he was in no way obligated to do. Leonard did not sell the mineral rights. What he did, in the spring, was contact the Royal Canadian Legion branch in Princeton and ask them who he should talk to about veterans who were having trouble with housing. The man who called him back was a retired master corporal named Douglas, and they talked for 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon, while Scout slept under the kitchen table. Leonard had spoken to Isabel about the legal structure. A portion of the property, 12 acres on the east side of the creek, sheltered with its own water access, could be severed and held by a charitable trust, not a development, not a sale. A place eventually for veterans who needed somewhere to land. Nothing elaborate, quiet land. A place to work and walk and not have to explain yourself to anyone. It would take time. These things always did. But by the time the snow melted and the creek came back up loud and the ponderosa pines started putting out their new growth, that yellow-green that only lasts a week in May before it deepens, Leonard had the sense that he was doing something his brother had anticipated, that the documents in the fireproof box, the water rights, the surveyor's report, all of it had been waiting for someone to use them the right way. He stood at the edge of the creek one morning in late May, coffee in hand, Scout moving through the long grass at the bank, nose down and purposeful. She stopped at a flat rock above the water and sat, the way she did when she'd found something she wanted him to see. He walked over and stood beside her. There was nothing there but the rock and the water, and the mountains east of them still holding snow on their high faces. But Scout stayed sitting, looking out at it, and Leonard stood with her for a while. The cup of greed is never full. He had read that in a comment someone had left on a video online. Some stranger, somewhere, watching some other story about loyalty and what gets left behind. He had thought about it for days. His brother had left him land, and documents, and a combination only family would know, and one instruction: go there before you decide anything. He'd gone there. Scout had found the hatch. The rest, Leonard figured, was just living.